For you created my inmost being, you knit me together in my mother's womb. Psalm 139:13. Have you ever wondered where you fit in the overall epic of humanity? I mean, if you could look at a narrative map of eternal history, where would your story be placed on that map? Well, here's where you are. Let's say I invited you to my house for a barbecue. The intent would be to enjoy each other's company, mingle with friends, eat some great food, and maybe play some games. But let's say when you got there, something terrible had happened. Let's say the propane tank for the grill exploded and a lot of people were injured. Essentially, that's where we are in the history of the world. Things are not as they were intended to be, and we're showing up on the scene after the accident. Christian theology states something terrible happened in the world. We refer to this event as the fall of man. Specifics are vague, but we do know mankind walked away from God and the results were devastating. I suspect we will learn more once we are with God, but for now the reality that our story has been corrupted is rather obvious. There's no question that the intention of God's story has changed. He intended to create a time and a place and a creation to interact with Him. But because mankind chose their own way, He's distant. And He's not distant because He wants to be. He's distant because He has to be. His nature cannot mix and mingle with those who don't want anything to do with Him. Let's just say He has a great sense of boundaries. But He's not panicking about it because He already knows the story's end. But He's calling on us to help. I've heard the definition of sanity as the ability to align ourselves to reality. If that's the case, denying something terrible has happened is the epitome of insanity. After all, the subject of the nightly news is always the same. What's wrong with the world, and how can we fix it? But none of our earthly governments are going to fix our problem. The problem is we were designed to be in relationship with God, and until we are reunited with Him, things aren't going to work out. So what do? If you showed up at a barbecue and there had been a terrible accident, the sober and sane thing to do would be to put down the potato salad and address those who were hurting. Of course, life is not so simple as a barbecue. It's complicated. There are all kinds of ways people have been hurt. Marriages are in trouble, people suffer from self-hatred, and temptations to numb ourselves from the pain are everywhere. To be sure, there is nothing we can do to restore life to where it was before the fall. Christian leaders who say you can be the person God designed you to be are well-intentioned, but being the person God designed you to be is not possible in this lifetime. We will not be perfect in this lifetime. When we are reunited with God, all our insecurities will be gone. We will be so enthralled by His company, we will lose ourselves in comparison. This is what it was like to walk with God before the fall. We were so enamored with Him, we were hardly aware of ourselves. We will be the person God designed us to be when we are reunited with Him, and until then we have to wait in patience, hope, and faith. There will be no perfecting of ourselves this side of God's return, so we might as well stop kicking ourselves around about our faults. God is inviting us to participate with Him in saving many lives. The story of Joseph takes up more space in the book of Genesis than any other story. The creation of the earth and the fall of man are summarized in only a few chapters, while the story of Joseph is given 13 chapters. And it's no wonder. It's a remarkable story with many ups and downs, and it has a great deal to teach us about how God interacts with humanity. Joseph has to go through a lot of hard times, but God is always with him. At the end of the story, Joseph says something interesting. He says all the hard events in his life were given him so God could use him to save many lives. Just take a look at Genesis 50:19. In fact, there are 2 other places in the story where Joseph makes it known that the point of his subplot was to save many lives. While Joseph may have had no idea why the things that were happening to him were really happening, he figured it out by the end. He was participating in God's effort to save many lives. The life theme of every major character in Scripture, every leader who follows God, is the same. They are participating with God to save many lives. Abraham is used by God to save many lives, and so is Moses. David saved lives when he was cooperating with God, and so did Solomon in all his wisdom. The apostles who built the early church were single-focused, and they saved many lives. If we would like to participate in what God is doing in the world, we must help Him save many lives. What does participating with God to save many lives look like? When we look at the life of a person who is participating with God to save many lives, it's a roller coaster. We'd think when God decides to change the world through us, it would feel as though we'd won the lottery. But it's never that way in Scripture. When God works through a person, their life is often hard. Let's go back to the life of Joseph and use his life as an example. So we're going to be looking at information from Genesis 37 through 50. As I've said, screenwriters and novelists use the terms positive term and negative term when they talk about the events their characters go through. We will use the same terminology to better understand how God has ordered our lives. So about Joseph, he was a man called by God and watched over by God from the beginning to the end. Let's consider how many positive and negative turns he experienced. First, he hears from God in a dream that he will be very powerful. Then he's thrown down a well because he bragged about it to his brothers. Then he's taken into slavery. But he excels in slavery and ends up running Potiphar's house. Potiphar was a commander in Pharaoh's military. But sadly, he's unjustly accused of raping Potiphar's wife, so he's thrown into prison. Still, the prison is a special prison for members of Pharaoh's government, and Joseph continues to excel until he ends up running the prison. While in prison, he interprets the dreams of two of Pharaoh's confidants. But when they get out of prison, they forget about him, so he spends at least 2 more years waiting for justice. It's only when Pharaoh has a dream himself that Joseph finally stands before the seat of power. Because of all of Joseph's negative turns, though, he is uniquely capable to advise Pharaoh. He interprets Pharaoh's dream and advises the leader on next steps. Pharaoh then makes Joseph his second in command. And why was Joseph qualified? For many reasons. First, he could empathize with the marginalized. Remember, he was thrown in that well. Then he understood how the military worked, and he'd need a military to expand government powers. He'd learned about that by running Potiphar's household. And because he ran the prison, he had intimate knowledge of every facet of Pharaoh's government. Because of the positive and negative turns in Joseph's life, he was uniquely qualified for the power he'd been promised. And not only this, but by the time he'd been given power, his heart had changed from an arrogant young kid to a wise and powerful leader. What if the events of your life have prepared you for something too? The first time Don Miller created his life on a timeline like this, he was working with a life coach, and together he put his positive and negative turns on the timeline. Then they stood back and looked at the timeline. As Don looked at his timeline, he could see a theme that had developed, and the theme he wrote down was God is always with me. Since that time, Don has edited his life theme, and it now is to share the story of God and help others find their subplots in his story. He uses that theme as a decision filter. In other words, he rejects almost any opportunity that does not reflect the theme of his life. He does this because of his training as a writer. He knows firsthand writers must make tough decisions. A good writer will throw away any brilliant scene that is not in keeping with the theme of his story. And a person who knows their storyline will do the same thing. The best part about knowing the theme of our story is that when we do, we know what to leave out. Your story matters. In a book by Dwight Eisenhower, the author talked about his mother's belief that every child should be raised to understand that if they didn't exist, their family would fall apart. Imagine that for a second. Imagine a world in which every person understood they were needed in the world, that they could be the solution to a problem. Eisenhower is best known for being president, but before he was president, he led the troops in World War II, uniting the Allies in the fight against Hitler. And why? It's likely because he was raised to believe the world needed him and even expected something from him. Do you know the same is true for you? I mean that question literally. Do you know the world needs something from you? Are you intimately aware the positive and negative turns in your life have prepared you to participate in God's effort to save many lives? There are probably days when you feel like the world would be better off if you just stayed in bed, but that is not true. God created you, and He created you with the power to bring light into darkness and order into chaos. You are necessary, and the sooner you believe that, the sooner you'll bond with God in living a great story. The most dangerous person in the world is a person who does not understand how powerful God made them to be. These people recklessly destroy because they think they are invisible and they don't matter. But the sad and happy truth is they do matter. They matter to everybody around them. When we own the seemingly magical nature of our existence, we can be more effective in participating with God to save many lives. Please understand, your story matters. Don't play the victim and say, "Aw, shucks," because to do so is to insult God. You didn't make yourself in your mother's womb. God did. And to say you aren't important is to say His creation lacks substance. Are you the center of the world? No. But the one who created the world created you. Accept this fact, and with it the responsibility to live a great story. Lives depend upon it.